The small art gallery had always been a quiet corner of the city, tucked between a bookstore and a cafe that always smelled of freshly brewed coffee. On most days, it was filled with tourists who wandered in, hoping to find something worth their time. It was a place where art seemed to be secondary to the need for conversation pieces. The gallery owner, Raymond Steele, was used to this. He preferred the quieter, more predictable days, where he could sit behind his desk, sipping on a coffee, pretending to engage with the few patrons who walked in. Raymond was a man of wealth, a man of privilege, and his gallery was an extension of that wealth. His focus was on selling the works of well-established artists, those with recognizable names, whose pieces would fetch high prices to wealthy collectors. He didn't have time for unknowns, especially not for those who didn't fit his idea of what art should be. Then one rainy afternoon, a man walked into the gallery that would change Raymond's life in ways he could never imagine. Derek Williams was not what Raymond expected. He was tall, with a presence that was immediately noticeable, despite his quiet demeanor. His clothes were simple, dark jeans, a gray hoodie, and a pair of old sneakers, but there was something about the way he carried himself that demanded attention. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't desperate for validation. His eyes, dark but filled with a fire that Raymond had only seen in the faces of artists who knew their worth, told the real story. Derek's art had been his life for years. His pieces, abstract, vibrant works that drew from his experiences growing up in a neighborhood that often felt forgotten by the world, had never found a place in the mainstream art world. Despite his undeniable talent, he was still struggling to make a name for himself. But Derek knew one thing: his art would one day speak for itself. When Derek walked into Raymond's gallery, it wasn't by accident. He had been to other galleries, other shows, where his work was dismissed without so much as a glance. But something about Raymond's gallery intrigued him. Maybe it was the way it stood apart from the others, the quiet atmosphere that seemed to invite introspection. Or maybe it was because Derek had done his research. He knew Raymond's reputation as a tastemaker in the art world, even if he had built that reputation by selling pieces that only catered to the upper echelons of society. Raymond looked up from his desk as Derek approached, his eyes narrowing slightly, sizing him up. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone professional, though tinged with the usual condescension reserved for those who didn't fit his image of an artist. Derek stood still for a moment, letting the question hang in the air. He had been dismissed so many times before that he no longer felt the sting. He was here for a reason, and that reason was bigger than any one gallery, bigger than any one person. But he had learned over the years that patience was often the best approach. "I'm Derek Williams," he said calmly, offering a firm handshake. "I have some pieces I'd like to show you. I believe you'll find them interesting." Raymond didn't take the handshake at first. He studied Derek, noticing the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his eyes. Raymond was used to dealing with the kind of artists who sought validation, who walked into galleries almost pleading for recognition. Derek, however, seemed like he was offering something, not asking for anything. Raymond's interest was piqued. "Let's see what you've got, then," Raymond said dismissively, motioning toward the back of the gallery where a small, private viewing room awaited. Derek followed, carrying a small portfolio with him. As he laid out his work on the table, Raymond didn't immediately react. Instead, he flipped through the portfolio with a critical eye, looking at each piece with a detached disinterest. Derek had expected this. He had always encountered this kind of dismissal from people like Raymond. But he was used to it. It had become second nature to him not to be fazed by the reactions of those who couldn't see beyond the surface. Raymond, however, was not impressed. He took a step back and looked at Derek with a hint of disdain. "This is fine, I suppose," he said, but the way he said it made it clear that he didn't believe it was worth anything more than a passing glance. "But, to be honest, I'm not sure this will fit with the kind of work we're looking to feature here. The art world is looking for something more polished. Something more refined." Derek's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard this before, countless times from people who couldn't see the value of his art because it didn't fit into their narrow expectations of what art should be. He had seen it in the eyes of curators who thought they knew better, and in the voices of critics who claimed to understand the nuances of creativity but were blind to the stories behind the art. Refined? Derek repeated, his voice steady. My work is refined in its own way. It tells a story. It speaks to the struggles of my community, to my experiences. It's not about being polished, it's about being real. Raymond looked at him, his lips curling into a sneer. Real? He repeated, as if the very idea of real was beneath him. Look, kid, I don't doubt you've got some talent. But art needs to have value, and value is something you don't get by just slapping colors on a canvas. You need to understand what sells, what people want to see. Derek's pulse quickened, but he remained composed. He had spent years perfecting his craft, pouring his soul into every piece, and he knew that one day the world would recognize his work for what it was, powerful, revolutionary, and beautiful. Raymond's words stung, but they wouldn't deter him. He had a bigger vision, and it wasn't tied to a gallery like this one. I don't need your validation, Derek said quietly, standing up. But one day, you'll see the value in what I do. You'll regret turning me away. Raymond chuckled lightly, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Is that a threat? Because, trust me, there's nothing special about your work. You're just another artist hoping for a break. It's not gonna happen here. Derek took a deep breath and smiled faintly. I'll remember this moment, Raymond. You'll regret it. And with that, he turned and walked out of the gallery, his mind already racing with thoughts of the future. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be more rejection, more doors slammed in his face. But Derek was no stranger to adversity. He had fought for everything he had, and he was not about to let a small-time gallery owner tell him what his art was worth. As Derek walked into the rainy street, he couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. He knew this was just the beginning. He would make sure Raymond and everyone else who had doubted him would eventually understand. And when that day came, it would be far too late for them to turn back. Derek walked away from Raymond Steele's gallery, the rain hitting his face like tiny, stinging reminders of the world's indifference. But as he crossed the street, his mind began to shift from anger to something more productive, determination. He wasn't going to let a gallery owner's narrow vision define his art. What Raymond didn't know was that Derek's art wasn't just a product of his personal experiences. It was part of something far greater, something hidden from the public for generations. The world had yet to understand the significance of Derek's work, but that was about to change. He returned to his modest apartment, a small, two-bedroom unit on the edge of the city. It was far from glamorous, but it had everything Derek needed: space, silence, and a sense of connection to the past. His grandmother's old paintings hung on the walls, a constant reminder of his roots. The family legacy was embedded in every brushstroke, every color choice, and every canvas. But it wasn't just her works that kept Derek connected to his legacy, it was the family secret that had been passed down through generations. Derek's grandmother, a brilliant artist in her own right, had created some of the most stunning and intricate pieces of her time. However, her art was never widely recognized. When Derek was a child, she would often speak to him about the history of their family's artistic lineage, carefully explaining how they were once part of a much larger artistic movement. The secret, though, was that this movement had been stifled by those who wanted to control the narrative of art, especially art that emerged from the struggles and voices of marginalized communities. She had told Derek that his talent wasn't just his own, it was part of a larger, more powerful legacy. For years, Derek had kept his grandmother's story to himself. The art world didn't want to hear about the struggles of a black artist, nor did it care about the nuances of his heritage. They were too busy chasing trends and selling the same repetitive ideas over and over again. But Derek knew that the world needed his voice, needed the authenticity that came from his bloodline, and he was determined to see it recognized. Sitting at his desk, Derek pulled out a box from under his bed, a box filled with old journals, letters, and paintings from his family's past. He opened the lid and gently touched the pages, his fingers tracing the faded ink that told stories of generations of artists who had never seen their true potential realized. Each journal contained a record of his ancestors' art, pieces that had been hidden away in private collections, never seen by the public eye. Derek's grandmother had told him that these works had once been invaluable, known by only a select few who understood their importance. But with the passage of time, these pieces had slipped into obscurity. The world had moved on, and the art that had once been revolutionary now seemed forgotten. Except for Derek. He had always believed in the power of this work, in its ability to speak to the soul of humanity. But the world wasn't ready. Not yet. Derek sifted through the journals, stopping at one that seemed different from the others. This particular book was older, its leather cover worn with age. Inside, the pages contained the story of an artist who had created works far ahead of their time. His great-great-grandfather had been an artist who had once been heralded as a visionary, but after his sudden disappearance, his works were sold off to private collectors and lost to history. According to the journal, Derek's ancestor had been a part of an underground movement of black artists who had once challenged the very fabric of the art world. They had created pieces that spoke to the struggles of their people, blending styles from African traditions with modernist movements. Their art was radical, speaking of a future where their voices would no longer be silenced. But, just as they were beginning to gain recognition, the movement was suppressed by powerful forces in the art world. And, like so many artists before and after them, their legacy was buried. Derek closed the journal, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just read. It wasn't just his work he had to defend, it was the work of generations of artists who had been erased from history. The art world hadn't just overlooked his art, it had deliberately silenced the voices of his ancestors. Derek now understood the true depth of the mission before him. He wasn't just creating art for himself, he was resurrecting a movement that had been unjustly forgotten. His mind began to race with ideas. He needed to bring his ancestors' story into the public eye, to prove that the art world had underestimated the value of what they had been dismissing. It wasn't just about making money or gaining fame, it was about restoring a history that had been stolen. Derek now had a plan, a vision that would take time, but would ultimately change everything. The first step was simple, he would begin selling his work in private circles, people who understood the value of his art, people who knew that there was more to Derek's pieces than met the eye. He had connections, collectors who had been following his work, not for its current worth, but because they recognized the potential in what he was doing. He would start small, building a network that would help him spread the word about his art and its legacy. The second step would be more difficult, he needed to get his work into the hands of the right people, the ones who had the power to recognize its true value. But to do that, he had to remain patient. He had to wait for the world to catch up. Derek wasn't going to beg for attention. He wasn't going to waste his time chasing galleries like Raymond's that wouldn't see the bigger picture. He had always been an outsider in the art world, one of the countless overlooked artists fighting for a break. But Derek knew he wasn't like everyone else. He wasn't just an artist, he was a custodian of a legacy. And when the time was right, the world would understand. The weeks passed, and Derek's work began to generate whispers in the art community. The pieces he had quietly sold in private shows were being talked about, but no one knew who the artist was. Collectors began to notice something familiar about the work, a depth and richness that wasn't common in the art world. A few even started to trace the origins of the pieces, realizing that they were linked to something much larger. The rumors began to spread. Meanwhile, Raymond Steele's gallery continued to operate as it always had, offering the same stale art that had come to define his space. He still hadn't heard about Derek's work making waves in the underground art scene. But Raymond was about to receive a rude awakening, one he would never forget. It had been several months since Derek walked out of Raymond Steele's gallery, and the art world was beginning to take notice. But not in the way that Derek expected. His work, which had once been dismissed by galleries like Raymond's, was quietly beginning to circulate in private art circles, sparking quiet intrigue. Small private shows and underground venues started to feature his pieces, and art collectors with an eye for authenticity began to recognize the power and depth of his work. At first, Derek was cautious. He didn't want to jump into the spotlight too quickly, not when he was still piecing together the complex puzzle of his legacy. But as more and more collectors started approaching him, asking for commissioned pieces or trying to track down his works from private shows, Derek couldn't deny it any longer. His art was starting to gain real value. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the recognition of his voice, the acknowledgement that what he had created was more than just art, it was a cultural revolution waiting to happen. But Derek knew he had to keep his movements measured. He didn't want to be swallowed up by the same art world that had rejected him and his family's legacy. He wasn't going to sell out just to fit in. He needed to make sure that when the time came for the world to fully appreciate his work, it would be on his terms. Through word of mouth, Derek's art began to spread across the city. The first breakthrough came when a well-known art historian, Dr. Valerie Clark, reached out to him. Dr. Clark had been following the whispers about Derek's pieces and was intrigued by the stories surrounding his work. She had done some digging and had found connections between Derek's art and the forgotten movement of Black artists from decades before. Dr. Clark was a champion of reclaiming lost art history, particularly the work of marginalized artists who had been overshadowed by dominant cultural narratives. She recognized the importance of what Derek was doing and wanted to help bring his work to a larger audience. Derek was skeptical at first. He'd spent years keeping his art away from the mainstream, knowing how the art world operated. It wasn't just about creating, it was about who controlled the narrative. But after several conversations with Dr. Clark, he began to trust her. She was genuine in her desire to elevate his work, not to exploit it for profit, and she had the academic knowledge and connections to help him navigate the tricky world of high-profile galleries and collectors. One evening, after a long day of painting, Derek received a call that would change everything. A renowned art collector named Charles Beaumont had heard about Derek's work and wanted to meet with him personally. Beaumont was known for collecting rare and invaluable pieces, works by artists who were either forgotten or who had yet to be recognized for their true worth. Derek had heard the name before. Beaumont was no ordinary collector, he had a reputation for backing the right artists, and when he took interest in something, the art world paid attention. The meeting was set for the following week. Derek felt a mix of excitement and nerves as he prepared for what could be his big break. He had always dreamed of having his work seen by people of influence, but now that it was becoming a reality, Derek knew he had to be strategic. This was no longer just about his personal ambition. It was about the future of the art movement his family had been a part of for generations. He couldn't let himself be blinded by the prospect of fame or wealth. He had to stay focused. The day of the meeting, Derek was both nervous and confident. He dressed in his usual understated way, dark jeans, a simple shirt, and his worn sneakers, but there was an air of authority about him now, a quiet confidence that had been building ever since he realized the true value of his work. When he entered the meeting space, Beaumont was already there, seated at a sleek, modern table, his eyes scanning over a series of sketches that Derek had brought with him. Charles Beaumont was a man who spoke with authority, but there was something in his voice that was almost welcoming, like he genuinely wanted to understand the art he was seeing. As soon as Derek sat down, Beaumont spoke. "Mr. Williams, I've been following your work for some time now," Beaumont began, his tone professional but curious. "What you're doing is different. It's powerful. There's an authenticity here that you don't find every day in contemporary art." Derek leaned forward slightly, feeling the weight of the conversation settling in. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady. "It's not just me. It's part of something much bigger, something that's been hidden for far too long." Beaumont nodded, as if he understood. "I know about your family's legacy. Your great-great-grandfather was part of a movement of Black artists who were erased from history. But I believe your work is more than just a tribute to that history. It's a continuation of it. And that's what the world needs to see." Derek felt a surge of energy. Finally, someone understood, not just the art, but the purpose behind it. Beaumont continued, "I'm offering you a deal, Mr. Williams. I want to help you get your work into the right places, high-profile galleries, the kind of venues that recognize true talent. I can help you make sure the world sees what you've created. But more than that, I want to offer you a partnership. A stake in a new gallery I'm opening. One that will focus on artists like you, those who have been overlooked or ignored. You'll be a curator, a guide, someone who shapes the future of art in this new space." Derek felt his heart race. This was exactly what he needed. A chance to not only have his work seen, but to control how it was presented to the world. To bring attention to the movement that his family had fought for, even in silence. He was no longer just an artist, he was going to be a catalyst for change. "I'll do it," Derek said, the words coming out before he could think twice. "I'll join you." Beaumont smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "I knew you would. You're going to change the art world, Derek. You already have." As Derek left the meeting, he couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. This wasn't just the beginning of his career. It was the beginning of something much larger. He was about to make history, and this time, the world would be watching. Meanwhile, Raymond Steele's gallery continued to operate under its usual routine. He had yet to hear about Derek's success. And, unbeknownst to him, the art world was already beginning to shift. Derek's works were gaining prominence, and the whispers were getting louder. Soon enough, Raymond would find himself caught in the wake of Derek's rise, and when that time came, he would regret every dismissive word he had ever spoken. The gallery opening was set for the following month. Derek could hardly contain his excitement, but he didn't allow himself to become complacent. He had spent the past few weeks perfecting his new collection, pieces that blended his family's legacy with a modern touch. He wanted to create something that wasn't just a statement, but a testament to everything his ancestors had fought for. Every brushstroke was an homage to a forgotten history, and each canvas was a step forward in a revolution that Derek knew was only beginning. Beaumont's new gallery, aptly named the Legacy Room, was going to be the perfect venue to launch his new collection. The gallery wasn't just another commercial space for selling art. It was a curated experience, one where the artist's stories were just as important as the work itself. The goal was to create a space that celebrated marginalized voices, especially those that had been overlooked by the mainstream art world. As the days passed, Derek spent hours perfecting his pieces, often working late into the night, the hum of his studio as much a companion as the brushes and paints that filled the room. There was one piece in particular that was consuming him. It was a large, mixed-media painting that intertwined elements of his great-great-grandfather's work with his own. It was raw, full of emotion, and spoke to the struggles of the Black community, past and present. Derek knew this piece would be the centerpiece of the exhibition, the one that would make a statement. But as the opening drew near, a storm was brewing outside the gallery's pristine walls. The art world was taking notice, and not all of it was positive. Derek's rising fame had attracted attention from the very people who had once disregarded him. Raymond Steele, still unaware of the growing buzz around Derek, had begun to hear whispers about the Legacy Room's upcoming exhibition. Word was starting to spread about Derek's work, and it was reaching places Raymond couldn't ignore. Steele's pride and reputation had always been built on his ability to pick what was in and sell it to the highest bidder. He was known for curating shows that aligned with what was marketable, not necessarily what was truly groundbreaking. His gallery had become a reflection of the safe and predictable nature of the art world he had built for himself. But now, there was a threat to that world. Derek Williams, an artist who had been laughed at and ignored, was about to open a gallery that could change everything. When Steele first heard about the Legacy Room, he didn't take it seriously. He assumed it was just another niche exhibition, one that would be quickly forgotten. But as the buzz grew louder and whispers of high-profile collectors planning to attend reached his ears, Steele knew he had to act. He couldn't afford to be overshadowed by someone like Derek, especially not someone he had dismissed so readily. One evening, Steele's assistant called Derek to inform him that Raymond wanted to meet with him. Derek wasn't surprised. He had expected this moment to come. What he didn't expect was the arrogance with which Steele approached the situation. Raymond's office was sleek and minimalist, a far cry from the gritty, authentic spaces Derek felt comfortable in. The walls were lined with high-end art pieces, works that had been bought and sold for millions, all carrying the same sterile, commercialized aura. Derek couldn't help but feel a slight disdain for the environment. He wasn't here to negotiate with Raymond Steele. He was here to make a statement. "Derek, it's good to finally meet you," Raymond said, extending a hand. His smile was forced, but there was a calculated charm in his voice. "I must say, I've been hearing a lot about your work. It's been interesting." Derek shook his hand, his gaze steady. "I'm sure it has." Raymond sat behind his desk, folding his hands. "Look, I've always believed in giving artists a second chance, and I'm offering you one. I know you've been doing well with your underground shows, but you've reached a point now where you need to make a choice. The legacy room? It's cute, but it's not where you belong. You need to be in a place where your work can reach the right people, the ones who can truly appreciate it. My gallery, on the other hand, can offer you that exposure." Derek's jaw clenched, but he kept his tone calm. "I'm not interested in your gallery, Raymond. I'm building something different, a space for artists who haven't been given the recognition they deserve. I don't need you to validate me. I've already found my own path." Raymond's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his smile intact. "You think you can build something bigger than this? You'll never make it without the right connections, Derek. You're just a flash in the pan, and people will forget about you as quickly as they discovered you." Derek leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "That's where you're wrong, Raymond. I'm not here for validation. I'm here to change the game. And I'll do it with or without you." Raymond's facade cracked for a moment, a flicker of anger passing through his eyes. But he quickly composed himself. "Fine," he said, standing up. "If that's how you want it, so be it. But don't come crawling back when this movement of yours falls apart." Derek turned and left the office without another word, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and anticipation. He knew he had made the right decision. The world wasn't ready for Raymond's brand of art, a sanitized, commercialized version that kept artists like him in a box. Derek wasn't just an artist, he was a revolution in the making. As the days passed, Derek's new gallery continued to gain momentum. Beaumont's vision for the legacy room was becoming a reality, and Derek's works were at the forefront of it all. The night of the opening arrived, and Derek stood at the entrance, watching as influential collectors, curators, and critics streamed into the gallery. The space was buzzing with energy, and it was clear that something special was happening. The centerpiece of the exhibition, the piece that Derek had poured so much of himself into, was displayed prominently in the center of the room. It was a bold statement, a fusion of past and present, rich with symbolism and emotion. People were drawn to it, speaking in hushed tones about the work's depth and the story it told. Raymond Steele had heard about the opening and sent a representative to attend. But as he watched from the sidelines, trying to gauge the reception of Derek's work, a cold realization crept into his mind. This wasn't just a passing trend. Derek Williams was changing the art world, and no matter how much money or influence Raymond had, he couldn't stop it. The world was waking up to the value of Derek's art, and with it, the legacy of the forgotten artists who had paved the way before him. The opening night at the Legacy Room was a triumph that neither Derek nor anyone else could have anticipated. Critics praised the raw, unapologetic emotion in his work, with some even calling it a revolution within the art world. The gallery was buzzing, not just with the usual high-end collectors, but with a younger generation of art enthusiasts who were drawn to the authenticity Derek's pieces exuded. His work wasn't just about art, it was about history, identity, and reclaiming the narratives that had been erased. It resonated deeply with people who had long felt invisible in the cultural landscape. Beaumont, ever the strategic businessman, knew that Derek's success was more than just a fleeting moment. It was a movement. And he had wisely positioned the Legacy Room as the center of that movement. The gallery quickly became a hub for emerging artists who had long been excluded from mainstream institutions. And Derek's influence, while still growing, was undeniable. But as Derek basked in the warmth of his newfound success, Raymond Steele was plotting. He had always prided himself on knowing the art world inside and out, and the rise of Derek Williams was threatening to unravel everything he had built. His gallery, once synonymous with prestige and high-dollar sales, was starting to feel stagnant in comparison. Derek's raw talent and the story behind his work were what the public craved, and Steele could feel the tide of influence shifting beneath his feet. Raymond wasn't going to let a young upstart like Derek challenge his position in the art world. He had built his career on selling artists, not nurturing them, and he wasn't about to let Derek's success tarnish his reputation. But his usual methods of control, high-pressure tactics and strategic alliances, didn't seem to have any effect on Derek. Every time Raymond tried to approach him, Derek remained cool, confident, and unwilling to compromise his artistic integrity. The tension was palpable. One afternoon, Derek received a phone call that he had been expecting, though he hadn't anticipated it would come so soon. Raymond Steele wanted to meet again. Derek felt a knot of unease in his stomach. He had already made it clear that he wasn't interested in doing business with Raymond. But he knew that this meeting would be different. Raymond had something else in mind. When Derek arrived at the location, a sleek, private art lounge that seemed to epitomize the kind of art world Raymond represented, he was met with the cold reception he'd come to expect from the man. Raymond stood behind a polished glass table, a smug smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Derek, I see your little gallery is doing well," Raymond began, his tone smooth, almost condescending. "But let's be real here. You and I both know that the legacy room is a niche. You've carved out a little corner for yourself, but how long can that last? The art world isn't built on movements, Derek. It's built on dollars and reputation. You're just another flash in the pan, and I'm afraid your 15 minutes are up." Derek stood his ground, refusing to let Raymond's words provoke him. "I'm not in this for a 15-minute moment, Raymond. I'm building something that will last. You might sell art, but you don't understand it. My work isn't for sale in the way you think. My legacy isn't a commodity." Raymond's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't get it, do you? I control the narrative in this industry. I'm offering you a way to scale your success. All you have to do is sign on with me, and I'll put your work in front of the right people, people who matter. You'll have galleries across the world bidding for your pieces. Isn't that what you want?" "No," Derek said firmly. "What I want is control over my art. What I want is to make a real impact. Not just sell it to the highest bidder." Raymond's eyes narrowed. "You think you can change the world with your little gallery and your idealistic vision? It's not going to happen, Derek. You'll burn out. I'm offering you a way to secure your future. And if you don't take it, you'll fade into obscurity. You'll be forgotten." For a moment, Derek could feel the weight of Raymond's words pressing in on him, but he quickly shook off the doubt. He had come too far to turn back now. "I don't need you to secure my future, Raymond. My future is already in the making." The conversation ended abruptly, with Raymond walking away, clearly frustrated. Derek knew the battle wasn't over yet. Raymond would never let go of the idea of controlling him. But Derek was no longer the artist that Raymond could dismiss. He was a force in the art world, and that made him dangerous to people like Raymond. As Derek left the meeting, he could sense the storm that was brewing. Raymond would never stop trying to bring him down, but Derek had learned something invaluable from his family's legacy, the power of persistence and staying true to one's own vision. And while Raymond had the money and connections, Derek had something far more powerful, the unwavering belief in his art, in his voice, and in his community. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The press coverage surrounding Derek's gallery continued to grow, and his exhibitions became more than just art shows, they were cultural events. Collectors were lining up, eager to get a glimpse of Derek's latest works. There were even rumors that a museum was planning a retrospective of his art, something Derek had never even dreamed of. Why? Yet, despite the growing success, he never let his ego get in the way. He continued to work with the same quiet intensity, knowing that his mission wasn't just about recognition, it was about giving a voice to the artists who had been silenced for far too long. But Raymond wasn't finished. He began to spread rumors about Derek's rise, calling his success overhyped and driven by media attention rather than actual talent. He tried to manipulate the art critics, pressuring them to turn against Derek's work. But each attempt seemed to backfire, only strengthening Derek's reputation as an artist who was unafraid to stand up against the status quo. The more Raymond tried to tear him down, the stronger Derek's resolve became. In the weeks that followed, the Legacy Room continued to thrive. The gallery was becoming a movement, and Derek's name was on the lips of everyone from museum curators to art critics to everyday people who had never cared about art before. But while Derek's success was growing, so was Raymond's resentment. The art world was shifting, and Raymond couldn't control it the way he once had. The final confrontation was inevitable, but it was also clear that Derek had already won. His legacy had already begun to take root, and there was nothing Raymond could do to stop it. The tide was turning, and no amount of money, power, or influence could erase what Derek had started. The art world would never be the same again. The art world was changing, and Derek Williams was at the forefront of that change. As his reputation spread like wildfire, the tide of support he had gained from artists, critics, and collectors continued to rise. He was no longer just a name to watch, he was a name that commanded attention. And as his influence grew, so did the resentment from those who had once dismissed him. Raymond Steele had always thought he could control everything, he thought he could bury Derek's rise with money, influence, and manipulation. But Derek wasn't just another artist in the art market, he was the embodiment of something larger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. The art world that Raymond had worked so hard to build was crumbling, and Derek was leading the charge. Raymond's frustration had reached a boiling point. His gallery, once the epitome of high society and prestige, had begun to show signs of stagnation. No one wanted the same stale, market-driven exhibitions. The collectors that Raymond once catered to now flocked to Derek's gallery, eager to be part of the new wave, the cultural revolution that was being birthed at the Legacy Room. Unable to accept this shift, Raymond hatched a final, desperate plan. He knew he couldn't crush Derek by ordinary means, so he began to target Derek's key supporters. He reached out to the museum curators, art critics, and even some of the collectors who had shown an interest in Derek's work, subtly undermining his reputation. Raymond painted Derek as a flash-in-the-pan artist, one whose fame was fueled more by social media buzz than by true talent. His goal was simple: make people doubt Derek's place in the art world. But what Raymond didn't anticipate was the strength of the community that Derek had built. The artists, the critics, the collectors, they weren't just supporting Derek for his art. They were supporting him because they saw in him a champion for the marginalized, a voice for those who had been overlooked by the traditional art world. The movement was about more than just Derek's name, it was about reclaiming power, telling untold stories, and challenging the status quo. One evening, Derek received a phone call that would change everything. It was from one of the prominent curators who had previously been swayed by Raymond's influence. "Derek, I just wanted to let you know that I've decided to stand by your work. I've seen what's happening, and I can't be part of the old guard anymore. I was wrong to let them pressure me into doubting you. Your work is revolutionary. And I want to help you make your mark in the art world, on your terms." Derek was taken aback, but deeply grateful. It was a powerful gesture, one that felt like the universe confirming that he was on the right path. The curators, critics, and collectors who had once hesitated began to publicly support Derek, signing petitions, writing articles, and attending his exhibitions. They weren't just buying his art, they were buying into the idea that art should be a force for change, not just a commodity. Raymond Steele's plan was unraveling before his eyes. His backdoor deals had failed, and the weight of his arrogance and elitism was finally catching up to him. The art world that he had spent decades building wasn't about to be overthrown in a single exhibition, it was being dismantled by the collective will of people who refused to be ignored any longer. Derek had inspired a revolution, and Raymond was losing control. In a final, bitter attempt to salvage his reputation, Raymond made one last offer to Derek. "Look, Derek, I'll put you in front of the most influential collectors in the world. I'll guarantee you international acclaim. All you have to do is sign with me. You'll never have to worry about money again. You'll have everything you've ever dreamed of." Derek stood in front of Raymond, the weight of the offer hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, he thought of all the times Raymond had belittled him, all the doors that had been slammed in his face, and the countless times he had been told he wasn't good enough. And then, he thought about the journey he had taken, the sacrifices, the late nights, the work that had brought him here. His legacy was already being built, but this offer from Raymond would destroy everything that had made it meaningful. "No," Derek said, his voice firm. "I've already got everything I need. I don't need your validation. I'm not in this for the fame or the fortune. I'm in this to change the world. And I'll do it without you." Raymond's face twisted in anger. "You think you're some kind of martyr, Derek? You think this movement of yours will last? It's a fad. It'll die out just like every other rebellion in the art world. You'll fade into obscurity, and no one will care." Derek didn't flinch. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'll fade away. But I'll never fade from the truth. And the truth is that the art world needs more than just a pretty picture to sell. It needs real stories. It needs voices that have been silenced for too long. And I won't stop until that message is heard." Raymond's shoulders slumped, the weight of his defeat settling in. There was nothing more he could say. The era of his control had ended. Derek Williams wasn't just an artist, he was a symbol of resistance, a beacon for the artists who had always been pushed aside. As Raymond left Derek's gallery for the last time, he could hear the murmurs of a new world being built, a world where art was no longer about making the elite rich, it was about empowering the forgotten. Derek had won, not by playing the game, but by changing the rules entirely. The next day, the press exploded with the news. Derek Williams was not only a leading artist of his generation, he was a cultural icon. His work had sparked a movement that transcended art and reached deep into the fabric of society. The old guard had fallen, and Derek's vision had taken its place. The world wasn't just watching his art, they were living it. Months passed since the pivotal showdown between Derek and Raymond Steele, and in those months, Derek's influence only grew. What had started as a small movement had now become a global force, with his exhibitions in major cities like Paris, New York, and London drawing crowds eager to see the work of the artist who had revolutionized the art world. Derek wasn't just a part of the conversation anymore, he was the conversation. His work, once thought to be niche and controversial, had transcended the boundaries of the art world. It had sparked debates in classrooms, boardrooms, and even on street corners. Derek's art told stories that resonated with people from all walks of life. It was a message of defiance, empowerment, and authenticity. It was a message that art didn't belong to the elite, it belonged to everyone. Derek's gallery, the Legacy Room, had become the epicenter of this revolution. It was no longer just a place to view art, it was a gathering place for like-minded individuals who shared Derek's vision for a more inclusive, authentic art world. The gallery's walls were filled with not just Derek's work, but the work of other marginalized artists who had found a voice through Derek's platform. These artists, who had once been overlooked by the mainstream, were now thriving in a world that embraced their diversity and their stories. The critics who had once dismissed Derek's work were now scrambling to write articles about his lasting impact on the art world. Museums and cultural institutions that had once ignored him now clamored to feature his work in major exhibitions. The critics who had once scoffed at his success were now eager to align themselves with his name, hoping to ride the coattails of the cultural shift Derek had instigated. But Derek, always humble, never let the attention go to his head. He knew the truth. This wasn't about him. It was about the movement, about the collective power of artists coming together to change the world. Despite his growing fame, Derek remained deeply connected to the community that had supported him from the beginning. He never forgot the artists who had stood by him during the tough times, those who had believed in his vision when no one else did. Derek wasn't just an artist anymore, he was a mentor, a leader, and a symbol of hope for those who still felt like outsiders in the art world. The pinnacle of Derek's success came when he was invited to speak at the prestigious Global Arts Summit, an invitation that was once reserved for the likes of Raymond Steele. The summit was held in Geneva, and it was a gathering of the most powerful figures in the art world. Curators, museum directors, collectors, and critics all gathered in one place, their eyes fixed on Derek as he took the stage. As he stood before the audience, Derek reflected on his journey. He thought about the early days of struggle, the hours spent creating in his small studio, the rejection letters from galleries that didn't understand his vision, and the painful words of Raymond Steele. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he had stayed true to his art, true to his voice, and true to the people who believed in him. Art is more than just a commodity, Derek began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It's more than just something to be bought and sold. Art is a reflection of who we are, of where we've been, and where we're going. For too long, the art world has been controlled by a select few, by those who think that art is something that can be owned, that can be manipulated, and that can be used as a means of profit. But art is not just for the privileged. Art is for everyone. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Art has the power to change lives, to shift perspectives, and to challenge the systems that oppress us. And as artists, it is our responsibility to use that power for good. We must tell the stories that have been silenced for far too long. We must lift up the voices of those who have been excluded from this world. Because when we do that, we don't just change art, we change the world. The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Derek had not only made his mark on the art world, he had made his mark on history. His words had struck a chord with everyone in that room, from the most powerful art collectors to the young, emerging artists who saw in him a beacon of hope. Raymond Steele was sitting in the audience, but he wasn't clapping. He wasn't even looking at Derek. He had long since been overshadowed by the wave of change that Derek had set in motion. Raymond had tried to play the game, to control the narrative, but in the end, he had lost. He had underestimated Derek's strength, his authenticity, and the power of the movement he had sparked. As the summit came to an end, Derek stood outside the Grand Hall, gazing at the sunset over Lake Geneva. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had done what he set out to do. The art world had changed, and his legacy was secure. But Derek's journey wasn't over. The movement he had started was only beginning. There were still artists whose voices had yet to be heard, stories still waiting to be told, and walls still needing to be broken down. Derek had ignited a fire, and now it was up to the next generation of artists to carry it forward. As Derek boarded the plane back to New York, he couldn't help but smile. The world had finally listened, and he had won, not just for himself, but for every artist who had ever been told they weren't good enough, not worthy enough, or not talented enough. In the end, Derek didn't just change the art world, he changed the way the world saw art. And that was the legacy that would endure, long after the applause had faded.